Welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing bipolar disorder. Okay, so in the previous video, we went over the monoamine hypothesis of mood disorders, and what I want to go on to in this video is a discussion of current treatment for bipolar disorder as far as drugs is concerned. But before I move on to that, allow me to summarize the monoamine hypothesis one final time. So, the monoamine hypothesis, of course, the stars of the show are the monoamine neurotransmitters. Now, the monoamine neurotransmitters are quite special neurotransmitters. They're quite rare neurotransmitters. Very few neurons in the brain release the monoamine neurotransmitters. And the three examples of monoamine neurotransmitters are serotonin, noradrenaline, and dopamine. So, as I say, very few neurons in the brain actually use these neurotransmitters, and those that do, their cell bodies are clustered together in these special brainstem nuclei known as the monoaminergic brainstem nuclei. Now, despite the fact that all the cell bodies are clustered together, the axons of these monoaminergic neurons leave the monoaminergic brainstem nuclei and go far, far away to loads of different parts of the brain and also the spinal cord. So all over the brain and the spinal cord, all over the central nervous system, you are getting axons coming from these monoaminergic brainstem nuclei, and the monoamines of the three different types will be being released there. So all over the brain, you get the three monoamines being released, and they are believed to modulate the whole brain's function. They're believed to control very global things, and the monoamine hypothesis boldly speculates or conjectures that serotonin may well modulate mood. It may well be the neural correlate of mood, i.e. the higher your serotonin, the better your mood, the lower your serotonin, the lower your mood. And that noradrenaline is the neural correlate of energy. The higher your noradrenaline, the higher your energy. The lower your noradrenaline, the lower your energy. And finally, dopamine is believed to be the correlate of volition, how easily you can promote up thoughts. The higher your dopamine, the higher your volition. The lower your dopamine, the lower your volition. So, those are the three monoamine neurotransmitters and what they are believed to actually regulate according to the monoamine hypothesis. So we can then use the monoamine hypothesis to speculate as to what is happening in a depressive episode and manic episodes. So in a depressive episode, we can therefore speculate that serotonin would be too low and noradrenaline would be too low for a long period of time to give rise to the dysphoria and the anergia. In a manic episode, meanwhile, we know, of course, that there are two different types of manic episodes. In a euphoric manic episode, all three of them would end up going up. In a depressive manic episode, noradrenaline and dopamine would go up, but serotonin would remain down. Okay, so we've seen what monoamine disturbances would correlate to these different types of episodes. The question I cannot answer, because there isn't really a satisfactory explanation even in this theory at present for how this occurs, is why people actually get these monoaminergic disturbances. But all I can say is that people with this disorder, unipolar depression, for some reason their brain is susceptible to this type of monoaminergic disturbance where for a period of time serotonin and noradrenaline go down. And people with bipolar disorder, they are susceptible to other types of monoaminergic disturbances as well. They can suffer both the manic episodes and the depressive episodes. So somehow you end up with these problems with the monoaminergic systems. Right, so let's now move on to discuss the treatment of bipolar disorder. So I think we'll go sideways and write the treatment over here. So I'll just put the title. We are discussing now the treatment of bipolar disorder. So I'm going to go through three classes of drugs. And the first one that we're going to start off with is a class of drugs that is very poorly understood called the mood stabilizers. And these are the major drugs that are used to treat bipolar disorder and bipolar disorder alone, really. So, as the name suggests, these are drugs that are going to stabilize your mood. They are going to, if we believe in the monoamine hypothesis, and we are going to suppose that we believe in the monoamine hypothesis, they're going to stabilize these disturbances in the monoamines, and they're capable not just of stabilizing one type of disturbance, but they're capable of stabilizing both the two major types of disturbances, so stabilizing the manic episodes and the depressive episodes. So what we believe is the case is that somehow these drugs stop whatever the process is that leads to the monoamine disturbances in the first place. So as I've just been discussing, for some reason in these people with mood disorders, they are prone to these monoaminergic disturbances. Somehow these drugs, we believe, must prevent that, but we don't know quite how. Now, they are usually just used in bipolar disorder rather than unipolar depression, although there are many studies which have found them useful in unipolar depression. The reason they're not generally used in unipolar depression is that they're generally not nice drugs to take, and there are nicer drugs that we can use in unipolar depression, so we don't generally give them these ones. So, let me give you some examples then of mood stabilizing drugs. So there are 5 major examples of mood stabilizers. The first and probably most famous one is lithium. So this is literally just the lithium ion. So lithium is an element in the periodic table. It's in group 1 of the periodic table above sodium. And when you take the drug lithium, you are literally just taking some ionic salt of lithium, and therefore you end up with this ion, lithium, in your bloodstream. And somehow that goes into the nerve cells within your brain and then can lead to changes in their behavior that reduces the chance of these monoaminergic disturbances and therefore reduces the chance of mood disturbance episodes, either manic episodes or depressive episodes. So that's the lithium, and I think I'll change colour. I don't really like this very rich green colour. We'll go for purple. Okay, so lithium is one. The other 4 mood stabilizers are all drugs that have been borrowed from neurology, and they are all examples of anti-epileptic drugs. So they are drugs that reduce the chance of epileptic seizures. So the other 4 mood stabilizers are examples of anti-epileptic drugs, and for short, you can abbreviate anti-epileptic drugs down to AEDs. So we got these drugs from neurology, but they are effective at stabilizing mood as well as stabilizing the brain from having epileptic seizures. So again, the mechanism is not well understood, but somehow, if we believe the monoamine hypothesis, they must reduce the chance that a disturbance in the monoaminergic system is going to occur, but I can't really give you any more information than that because we really just don't understand how these drugs are effective in treating bipolar disorder. So, let me give you their names to make up for that fact then. So there are 4 of these that are used. So the first one is sodium valproate, a very effective mood stabilizer. Now, there is a problem actually with sodium valproate and lithium, which limits their use. Both of these are extremely teratogenic, which means that if you take them whilst you are pregnant, they will lead to damage to the developing baby. So they are contraindicated generally in women of childbearing age. So you don't even need to be pregnant for them to be contraindicated. Anyone who could become pregnant, possibly, should not be given these drugs ideally. Sometimes they are still prescribed because nothing else is working, but ideally they shouldn't be prescribed to anyone who's capable of becoming pregnant, because if you end up taking this drug whilst you are pregnant, then the baby will almost certainly end up with birth abnormalities. So that limits their use because they are extremely teratogenic. So they're drugs that are generally only used in men or women past the age where they can become pregnant. So, sodium valproate is an example of an anti-epileptic drug, though, with mood-stabilizing properties. Now, the other 3 anti-epileptics that are used as mood stabilizers. Next one is a drug called Lamotrigine, a very effective anti-epileptic and also an effective mood stabilizer. Carbamazepine is the next one in my list. another very effective antiepileptic and also an effective mood stabilizer. And then finally, Carbamazepine as well, which is a drug very similar in structure to Carbamazepine, a quite new drug. So all of these drugs, sodium valproate, Lamotrigine, Carbamazepine, and Carbamazepine, they are all examples of antiepileptic drugs. People with epilepsy take them and they reduce the chance that they will suffer from an epileptic seizure. But we can also use them as mood stabilizers along with lithium, and they reduce the chance that people with bipolar disorder or indeed unipolar depression, but as I've said, we don't generally use these for unipolar depression because we have far safer drugs, but they are used in bipolar disorder, and they reduce the chance that someone suffering with bipolar disorder will actually have episodes, either depressive episodes or manic episodes. So, I can't really tell you much more about the mood stabilizers because I can't give you much more about the mechanism by which they work because we simply don't know how they work. But those are current drugs that are used to treat bipolar disorder, and remember that lithium and sodium valproate are extremely teratogenic and therefore are contraindicated in women of childbearing age. Right. Next class of drugs that I can tell you a little bit more about, the mechanism is going to be a little bit more juicy here. These can be used in people suffering from manic episodes who are currently extremely psychotic. So remember, one of the symptoms of a manic episode is that you can end up with psychotic symptoms, and we discussed why this is. So when volition is far too high, as it can become in a manic episode, you can end up promoting up thoughts that simply shouldn't be promoted up, known as aberrant salience. And this can give rise to hallucinations and delusions. So if you have someone who is suffering from a manic episode with very, very pronounced psychotic symptoms, it can be very difficult to treat these people because they're not generally compliant with the treatment, because they don't understand that there's anything wrong with them, because they can be quite delusional. And in these cases, there are drugs that can be used to reduce the psychotic symptoms, and they are drugs that are used to treat schizophrenia, known as the antipsychotics. Now, the antipsychotics, they do exactly what the name says. They are getting rid of psychotic symptoms. They are incredibly effective drugs at getting rid of voices that aren't there, at getting rid of visions that aren't there. So, if you are hearing voices that aren't there, these drugs generally will stop that. And they can also get rid of delusional thoughts. The reason they're called antipsychotics rather than antischizophrenics is that they do not get rid of some of the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. In fact, often they can make the negative symptoms of schizophrenia worse. So although they are the drugs that are majorly used to treat schizophrenia, this is the best name for them because they get rid of the psychotic symptoms of schizophrenia, the hallucinations and the delusions, but they do not get rid of the other symptoms of schizophrenia generally. So, antipsychotic drugs. Firstly, let me explain how these are going to work. So, just use a bit of logic here. We have said that the reason that you get the psychotic symptoms is because volition is far too high. Why is volition far too high according to the Monoamine Hypothesis? It's because dopamine is far too high. These drugs are going to work by stopping the effect of dopamine being too high. So, I need a little bit more information here. How does dopamine actually affect the behavior of other neurons? Well, it affects the behavior of other neurons by binding to receptors on the surface of other neurons, known as dopamine receptors. And there is one dopamine receptor in particular that's believed to be very important, which is the D2 receptor. So D stands for dopamine, and it's the type 2 dopamine receptor. So the D2 receptor is extremely important. Now, just to draw a little picture of this then, the D2 receptor is an example of a G protein coupled receptor. So, if these two parallel lines here represents the inner leaflet and the outer leaflet of the phospholipid bilayer, then the D2 receptor can be drawn like this. It has the classical 7 transmembrane domain structure, where it has 7 membrane-spanning alpha helices going across the cell membrane, like so. So, This picture here represents the D2 receptor, and for short I can abbreviate it down to the D2R. So loads of neurons in the brain will have D2 receptors on their surface. Dopamine can come along, bind to this receptor, change its structure, and cause it to interact with intracellular pathway proteins, and therefore trigger an intracellular cascade, which is how you actually bring about a change in the behavior of that neuron. So, what I am telling you then is the way that dopamine is actually going to work on its target is by binding to dopamine receptors. The majorly important one is this D2 receptor. So, if we want to reduce volition, we could do it by blocking this D2 receptor. If we block the D2 receptor, then even though there is raised dopamine in a manic episode that is causing the increased volition, if we block the receptor, that dopamine won't be able to bind to the receptor, and therefore it won't have the same effect on the behavior of neurons, and therefore we might be able to reduce the psychotic symptoms that you're getting because volition is far too high. And indeed, this is exactly what the antipsychotics do. They are all D2 receptor, and now I can try and fit in the final word there, antagonists. So remember back to pharmacology, an antagonist is a drug which binds to a receptor, so it can bind in here, I might even draw it in here. So this little red blob here can represent the drug. So it binds to the receptor in the binding site where the natural ligand would bind. So it binds where dopamine would bind in this case. It does not activate the receptor, so it doesn't cause the conformational change in the receptor that then allows the receptor to interact with intracellular signaling proteins. So it doesn't activate the receptor, and it simply blocks the natural ligand from being able to bind. So that's what is meant by a D2 receptor antagonist. Something that binds to the D2 receptor, does not activate it, but blocks dopamine from being able to bind to it. And if we gave a drug that does this, it will block the effect of dopamine on sites in the brain, and therefore will reduce the volition that the person suffering with the manic episode is experiencing. Okay, so this is what all the antipsychotics do. They are D2 receptor antagonists. They bring down volition, and therefore they bring down the psychotic symptoms which are due to the too high volition. So we split antipsychotics, and I've made a mess there. Let me just get rid of those blobs. So we split antipsychotics into two categories. As I said right at the beginning of this video, we absolutely love classifying things. So we split antipsychotics into two categories. The first generation antipsychotics, which are also called the typical antipsychotics. There are loads of first generation or typical antipsychotics. However, most of them are not used in bipolar disorder. The only real one that you see from the first generation antipsychotics that is used in bipolar disorder to treat psychotic symptoms is haloperidol. Very, very powerful drug, completely turns off volition. People taking it end up zombified, effectively. They just sit there, not really capable of doing that much because it's so much effort to do anything, because it's brought down volition so much by blocking D2 receptors. So it's a very powerful drug, and it does work. It does get rid of voices, it does get rid of delusional thoughts. There are other antipsychotics that are used, however, to treat bipolar disorder under the second category of antipsychotics, which are the second generation antipsychotics, also called the atypical antipsychotics. Now, there are 6 major examples of second generation or atypical antipsychotics, and all of those 6 can be used to treat bipolar disorder when they've got pronounced psychotic symptoms and you want to get rid of those. So, the 6 examples here are quetiapine, then aripiprazole, then risperidone. So these are all very widely used drugs. Risperidone, they're very strong drugs. They can have quite nasty side effects. Aripiprazole is the one that's best as far as the side effect profile is concerned. So it's often one that is tried first because it has the fewest side effects. Continuing on, just moving this up a bit. Next one down, I'll put olanzapine, very famous second generation antipsychotic. Another very important one to know about is amisulpride. And then finally, the most powerful antipsychotic of them all is clozapine. If none of the others work, then clozapine can be used. A scary drug. It can have horrendous side effects, but it is a very, very powerful drug, the best antipsychotic we have. If none of the others work to get rid of the voices, clozapine usually will work. So it is a drug that saves people's lives, even though it can have horrendous side effects on the body. So, to summarize what I've just told you, we can use antipsychotics to treat bipolar disorder, specifically when someone is having a manic episode of bipolar disorder and they are extremely psychotic. Then antipsychotics can be given to reduce the psychotic symptoms. These work by reducing volition, by blocking the D2 receptor, and we split them into these two different categories: first generation antipsychotics, also called the typical antipsychotics, and the second generation antipsychotics, also called the atypical antipsychotics. There are loads of first generation antipsychotics. The only one that's really used to treat bipolar disorder is haloperidol. There are 6 major examples of second generation antipsychotics, all listed here: quetiapine, aripiprazole, risperidone, olanzapine, amisulpride, and clozapine, and they can all be used to treat the psychotic symptoms of bipolar disorder. Okay, during a manic episode. So those are the antipsychotics that can be used. Finally, one final class of drugs that I want to talk about. You can use drugs from the antidepressants category of drugs, which are usually used to treat unipolar depression. And of course, these can be used when either the person is suffering from a depressive episode or when they're suffering from a depressive manic episode and you want to bring up serotonin. So there is a class of drugs known as the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which will bring up serotonin, and these can be used either when someone with bipolar disorder is in a depressive episode or when they're in a depressive manic episode, to bring up the serotonin to make them happier, to reduce risk of suicide. Okay, so the final category of drugs then is the SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are an example of a class of drugs from the antidepressant class. So this stands for selective, that's the first S, and then it's serotonin, that's the second S, and then reuptake inhibitors. So again, the name is very explicit. It tells you exactly what these drugs are going to do. They're going to selectively inhibit the reuptake of serotonin, which is how they're going to increase serotonin. So, let me start by going over their mechanism, and then I'll give you the examples of SSRIs. So, these work in a very different way to the antipsychotics. They're going to work to increase serotonin, and the way they're going to do it is by stopping the reuptake of serotonin. So let me just draw an axon terminal here. So this is supposed to represent the terminal of an axon that's going to be releasing the serotonin. So specifically, we're imagining it is a serotonergic neurons axon terminal. So in this axon terminal, you will have synaptic vesicles that will be full of serotonin, and when action potentials arrive in the axon terminal, these synaptic vesicles will be released and serotonin will be released into the extracellular fluid. Now, that serotonin is not allowed to stay in the extracellular fluid forever and ever and ever, otherwise it would just build up and up and up and up. So, what this cell membrane of the axon terminal also has is pumps for reuptaking the serotonin. So let me draw this here. So this little green blob, this can represent a pump for reuptaking serotonin, and this is called a serotonin reuptake transporter. So the serotonin reuptake transporter. And for short, you can abbreviate the serotonin reuptake transporter down to the SERT. So SE for serotonin, and then R for reuptake, and then T for transporter. So quite simply, what this does is it pumps the serotonin back into the cytoplasm of the axon terminal, and therefore the serotonin won't remain in the extracellular fluid forever. So it's released for a while, and then it's gradually pumped back in, and then it will be repackaged back up into synaptic vesicles and released once more when another action potential comes along. So, how can we increase the amount of serotonin in the extracellular fluid to try and bring up mood, when of course we can block the serotonin reuptake transporter from working, and this is exactly what the SSRIs do. So the SSRIs, they all bind to the serotonin reuptake transporter, the SERT, on the axon terminals of serotonergic neurons, blocking it from working. The serotonin therefore remains in the extracellular fluid, it goes up and up and up, and that hopefully is going to elevate one's mood and make you feel better. Okay, so examples of SSRIs. So there are 5 major examples of SSRIs. Firstly, we'll start off with the absolutely infamous one, the most famous one easily, fluoxetine. And you might say, well, I've never heard of fluoxetine. You will have heard of its famous brand name, Prozac. So fluoxetine is the proper name for Prozac. Prozac was the brand name that the first company that created it named it. But fluoxetine is the generic name. So fluoxetine is a major example of an SSRI, famous because it's the one that is generally given to teenagers who are suffering from a mood disorder, some sort of depression in mood. And the reason it's generally given to teenagers and not older people suffering from depression is because it interacts with a lot of other drugs. So if you're taking other drugs, you won't generally be prescribed fluoxetine because it can interact with many other drugs. So that's why teenagers are generally the people who it's given to, because they're not going to be on any other medications, or they're unlikely to be on any other medications. So fluoxetine, the most famous SSRI easily. Other examples, sertraline is a highly used example. Citalopram is also a very important example to know about. 2 drugs that are less commonly prescribed than those 3 are paroxetine and also S-citalopram, and that completes my list of SSRIs. So S-citalopram is another example of an SSRI. So those 5, fluoxetine or Prozac, sertraline, citalopram, paroxetine, and S-citalopram, they are all examples of SSRIs. They will go into the brain, bind to the serotonin reuptake transporters, block them from working, block the reuptake of serotonin. Serotonin will go up and up and up and improve your mood. Okay, so these can be used in bipolar disorder when you need to bring up someone's mood. So if they're either having a depressive manic episode or a depressive episode where serotonin is very low, we can give these drugs to raise serotonin to make them feel better. Okay, and that concludes my discussion of the treatment of bipolar disorder. So just summarizing what we have learnt here. The major category of drugs used to treat bipolar disorder are the mood stabilizers. These somehow reduce the chance that these disturbances in the monoaminergic systems will occur. We don't know how they work. Examples of mood stabilizers, an old one is lithium, not used in women of childbearing age because it's teratogenic, it damages the developing child. Other 4 mood stabilizers are borrowed from neurologists. They are anti-epileptic drugs. Sodium valproate is even more teratogenic than lithium, so again contraindicated in women of childbearing age. But the other 3, lamotrigine, carbamazepine, and oxcarbazepine, are nowhere near as teratogenic as these 2 and can be given to women of childbearing age. Okay, so they are effective at reducing the chance of episodes in bipolar disorder, both the manic episodes and also the depressive episodes. Do not forget that. Everyone seems to think that these just treat the manic episodes, but no, they treat the depressive episodes as well. They somehow reduce the chance that these disturbances in the monoaminergic system are going to occur. Antipsychotic drugs, these are used acutely when someone is actually in a manic episode. So if you like, these ones are more to try and prevent someone suffering with bipolar disorder from actually getting manic episodes or depressive episodes. Antipsychotics will be taken when someone is suffering from a manic episode and they are getting heavy psychotic symptoms with that manic episode. And they work by blocking the D2 receptor, reducing down volition, and therefore getting rid of the psychotic symptoms that come from that aberrant salience. We split the antipsychotics into the 1st generation and the 2nd generation. Haloperidol is the major one that's used in bipolar disorder from the 1st generation ones, and all of these 6 major examples of 2nd generation ones can be used as well. Finally, if we want to raise someone's mood who is suffering from a depressive episode or indeed a manic depressive episode, then we can give them SSRIs which will raise serotonin, and here are the 5 major examples of those. And with that, I will finish this video on bipolar disorder. Thank you for watching.